thanks very much for all of you who sent me your written responses. They're very useful for me to know how, as one of you put it, 20 years later, these essays read. And clearly, they remain as relevant and as important as perhaps they were at the time that they were written. And I think we're also seeing Gail through the present in some important ways, because I think um, much of what she wrote about are still matters of concern, and especially given the long drawn out farmer struggle that we've all been witness to, and how might we understand that apart from the fact that their concerns are not being heeded by the government, how might we understand the movement itself? And I think Gail offers us a certain set of principles and ideas by which we might see a movement such as this one, because the farmers movement was very central to many things that she wrote about in the 80s and 90s. That's one thing. And the second thing is feminism. And I also noted with concern that many of you had, not just in this workshop, but at other times too, pointed out that you had not had the chance to read her in your MA Women's Studies classes or in other classes, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, because as far as I knew, at least for some of us, that she was a feminist was common knowledge, A, and B, and at least two or three people I know have taught reinventing revolutions in their classes, in their women's studies classes. But I guess because Gail hasn't been part of a certain academic fraternity, and the work that she put out had such a wide ranging appeal, people did not take on board the many connected things that she was saying and looked for something specifically feminist, whatever that might mean. You know, is there anything specifically feminist, so to speak? So that may be another reason, but it's clear that here is a writer whose work we might want to continue to engage with in different ways. So thanks for the interest that you've shown in her work. So, for just to do a very, very quick and brief recap of what I did in the last workshop, basically, I introduced Gail's writings on feminism in two ways. One is I pointed out that much of what she had to say emerged out of her very deep and sustained engagement with different kinds of protests and struggles that she was witness to from the 1970s onwards. And these included really very distinctive kinds of struggles, starting from the anti-price rise movement on the one hand, which was led by communist women leaders, then rural women organizing spontaneously along with other left groups, demanding work at a time of drought and famine. Um, Middle class students and women in the cities protesting and coming together, young Dalit women in classic Ambedkarite context who now see Ambedkarism through a feminist lens. So there were very, very diverse groups that were on the streets and asking for a range of things. And Gail took her cues for understanding feminism as it was emerging in the Indian context from all these struggles. And as I pointed out last time, not just in Maharashtra where she lived, researched, and worked, but she kept her eyes and ears open to what was going on in the rest of India. And in a country as vast as this, a comparative perspective, both in terms of research and in terms of politics, is very important. And Gail constantly tried to put together struggles from different geographies just to show us what was common to them, what was different to each of those things. This is something you would have read in today's selection of readings. So I think those struggles were what made Gail interested in theorizing the women's movements. And as she says in one of her essays in your list for today, it is not that these women did not have things to say about themselves, but that they were not claimed for a feminist understanding of those times. And she clearly wanted to do that. So that's one thing. The second thing is, of course, she drew inspiration from her own research. She had come here for her PhD work and she studied the Mahatma Phule's movement and the Satyashodak Samaj and the politics and culture and society of that time. And that has remained a very important influence in her understanding of social reality. She doesn't really invoke Phule in very direct ways in all the essays that you've read so far, but in your essays for the last workshop, you will probably have a chance to see how she works with Phule. But basically, Mahatma Phule for her was a very important political, social, and philosophical figure. She saw him as inaugurating an anti caste politics and movement, and as important, an anti caste philosophy. And she viewed him as an important thinker and philosopher, as a theorist. And her very early work, Cultural Revolt, shows exactly how she understood him to be a philosopher. So, and I think she would go back to that vision in different ways. And today I will sort of indicate how she does in her writings, though she may not directly invoke him. And starting from there, she goes on to study the anti caste movements in detail, culminating in her famous work of the 1990s, Dalits and the Democratic Revolution. Dalit Visions, all these very important texts that came out in the 80s, 90s. And then, of course, what has over the last month or so since she passed on, a signature text, Seeking Begumpura, which contains in a nutshell what she viewed as the very important anti caste humanistic traditions of the subcontinent, starting from the Buddha, but also taking in the Bhakti traditions in Maharashtra, the atheism of Periyar, the Neo-Buddhism of Ayotitas and Ambedkar, a very fascinating array of figures. But that was a very important influence, and of course, all that she picked up from her own context, the United States, the anti-war movement, the civil rights struggle, the second wave of Anglo-American feminism, and I spoke of how she understood each of these in rather specific ways, and that for her, um, anti-war translated into anti-imperialism, and I sort of argued that we may want to differentiate her understanding of anti-imperialism from what perhaps we are familiar with in our classrooms, which is the whole post-colonial project, which is equally anti-imperialist, but which really centers its attention on discourse analysis. And even when it looks at historical events, it's concerned with the archive. It's concerned with texts, um, and events and histories as they emerge through the colonial archive, if you are to look at something like the subaltern studies. But also, equally, if you are to look at the many studies across the former colonies, there is a tendency to valorize the pre colonial past. Now, in the Indian context, that happens very early, as we all know, in the heyday of the nationalist movement. But Gail simply does not even consider that as an important development, while she grants it historical, significance in that it happened. There was this invocation of a Vedic golden age, etc. But what she's interested in is what did imperialism do to India? And how did it disarticulate its political economy, its caste system? What did it do to women's lives? So she basically looks at the experience of imperialism through this caste, class, gender, labor, foursome, and therefore she's not interested so much in the empire striking back, or deconstructing the colonial narrative so much as showing what were Indians themselves saying and doing through the long durée of late colonial India and subsequently. So that's important. And for her, the civil rights struggle, which of course came alive in the writings of African Americans, and there are many, many movements as these unfolded in the 1960s. For Gail, that represented a very radical experiment with democracy. And she would bring that same radical edge to her understanding of democracy, which is why the title of that book, Dalits and the Democratic Revolution. So, for those of us who are familiar with Marxist literature, we know that the democratic revolution is seen as a stage before the socialist revolution emerges. But for Gail, it was something valid, complete, and radical in its own right in a caste society and a gender society, and a society that was gendered in very specific ways. So she understood that from the way she saw race working in the United States, and how the revolution against race was a very significant aspect of what was unfolding in the United States of the 60s. And lastly, of course, the influences from feminism, which we went into great detail last time, and which we will continue to look at today. And as one of you had written in your responses, she didn't work with a template. She didn't think in terms of feminism having its origins somewhere and then arriving in India, and that it's not a question of it imitating the West, or could it even happen in a place like India. I mean, and this is something that's interesting because many of you might have followed the kind of anguish with which the world has greeted Afghanistan. It is almost as if Afghanistan cannot quite get a feminist grasp of what's going on, and we have to tell Afghan women what to do. But the fact is that societies do engender their own contradictions and their own social movements. And Gail understood this very long ago. So she's not really looking to place Indian feminism in some sort of a linear timescape, you know. First there was this and then there was that, but it's something that emerges out of Indian society and its contradictions itself. And as she says very, very sharply, women are the focus of every social contradiction. And therefore, the women's emancipation project must necessarily engage with every other form of liberatory projects. That's something also that she says. So, this is what we looked at last time. And today, what we're going to do is the Gail's understanding of feminism, which sort of emerged from practice and from her readings. How did it express itself? What is the feminist content of her writing? How does one understand her own feminism? You know, what she claimed for feminism. How is she feminist in her writings? So, and I think the what I'd like to do in this context is to look at how does Gail conceptualize the social order, because I think for her it was very important that an attempt to understand why women were out on the streets, why women were protesting and asking all these tough questions and making these demands cannot be seen only as a series of empirical actions. You know, it's not just that something's wrong and people are doing this, but it has to be granted a certain conceptual weight. And she sees women as capable of doing this themselves in conversation with other women, and this is something she values a great deal, but also in conversation with people around them, of movements of which they are a part, their neighbors, those that are in the struggle along with them, men and women, with ordinary citizens. So for her, the potential for theory is there in movements themselves. But what is required is to bring in what she calls the conscious element. How do you render these potent, latent theoretical possibilities? You know, how do you bring them? How do you foreground them? How do you then build this theory? So she doesn't think that a theorist is somebody who does this standing outside of the struggle. As she says in the methodological essay I'd given you last time, being part of what you're researching and converting your interview into a mobilizational argument is how she sees her own work. And so that's something also that I think we need to keep in mind. Therefore, when she theorizes the social order, she's doing so from the point of view of wanting to bring forth, foreground those conceptual ways of understanding the world that she sees around her and which she brings into a coherence. Given her training and her background, she sees herself as doing this, but this doesn't mean that she has the theory whereas the rural women have the practice. That's not what she means at all. There is a very strong linkage between theory and practice. And that linkage comes from how we attend to struggles on the ground. And that mode of attention is what she's very focused on, as you, I'm sure, saw from her writings. She looks at struggles, she looks at data, she puts women's demands and the kinds of things emerging from the ground in conversation with the data. Then she's looking at arguments around the data. Then she's looking at theories that sort of, you know, are the basis for these arguments. And from there on, she then comes up with a set of um, principles, if I may use the word, to understand the social order. So this is a way of thinking about theory and practice. And for those of you who've had a chance to see Deepa's films, especially something like A War and Taking Office, you would have noticed that the women in front of the camera were speaking about their lives, their intimate lives, their reproductive lives, their political understanding, their details of their work, are theorists in their own right. There's a great deal of clarity that emerges when women speak to each other, and equally a clarity in how the film assembles those voices for us. So, in that sense, whoever is invested in understanding women's struggles and in what women are saying to each other and to others, clearly work to bring that conceptual possibility to the fore, whether it's a film or an essay. And I think a film is useful because you actually see people in the flesh, and that is a very important thing. Rather, reading about the tobacco workers of Nipani is one thing, but actually to see them in their workplace, you understand what it means to be a waged worker and to be shortchanged on your wages. The strenuous work that is required of them, and the impossibly poor pay that they are given. So it's not simply a wage struggle as such, but you also see it is a struggle to stay human, to be dignified, and to be paid for the sweat of your labor. So I think that's what Gail tries to bring forth in her essays. And as I was telling Deepa Dhanraj, there's a very uncanny resonance the to your films and her work, and they're all roughly contemporaneous with each other. So clearly, there's a way in which a lot of us were invested in trying to understand how to bring ideas and politics together. And Gail, I think, does it with great aplomb and great finesse. So, what does she do then? And that's something that we need to look at. One thing she does is, and she does this in a very interesting way, is that she looks at the social totality. So, women are out on the streets, rural women are struggling. So, how do I understand this? So, what does she do in that 1970s essay, which is there in your reading pack? Which is that basically she gives you the reasons that she thinks are important as to why these women are struggling and why have they come to the streets and what gave them the courage to come to the streets. And she puts it down to their status as workers, and she engages with a form of scholarship that was emerging in women's studies and in economics at that time. How do you understand female labor? How do you value it? And so an economist came up with this thing of the women's work participation rate, how many women are actually working. And Gail really pulls that apart in different ways. She tells you there's no one answer to that question because it depends on the region, depends on the kind of agrarian economy you have in the region, and which women are you talking about, really? And she makes very clear, as far as rural India is concerned, almost everybody works. And those that work the hardest, the agricultural laborers, women are most represented in that section. So clearly, it is the lower caste, so to speak, Bahujan and Dalit women who form the majority of the workforce, with Dalit women perhaps the largest of that group. So when we say women are out on the streets and struggling, it is this segment that she sees as holding emancipatory potential. Dalit and Bahujan women who come out to struggle. And what? So that she tries to explain using data. Basically, she tells you, why am I saying this? I'm saying this for these reasons. And this is different across the country and in many, many different ways and so on. And she's basically trying to help us understand how women are actually producers. They're not simply workers who are there waiting to earn a living for their own families, but they actually are producing the food that you and I eat. And that's a very important factor that she will consider as central to our understanding of society. In the 70s essay, it's not foregrounded, but in the 80s, you will see that she's arguing that basically, if today you have a capital intensive industrial society in India, who is subsidizing that? It's women's unwaged domestic labor, it's women's wage labor that's far below the general kind of economic returns that obtain on labor, and the subsistence economy as a whole, which comprises both unwaged household labor as well as poorly paid public labor. It is this which actually keeps the society going. It is this which reproduces labor. It's this which makes it possible for workers to go to factories, for capitalists to keep building their various industries, which keeps agriculture and active and so on. So for her, therefore, these productive potential of these women is very, very important, and she calls attention to that in the very first essay that I've put out for you, and she marks the caste location of these women as well as how do you understand women's class and caste identities. Because if it comes to unwaged labor, every woman performs unwaged labor at home. Now, the interesting thing for Gail was the women who work in the fields, in the farms, and elsewhere. That labor is something that they understand they have some measure of control over because they can come together and fight and ask for better terms of existence. But within the household, it gets harder to negotiate and fight for things. So she's struck by this anomaly, that within the sphere of family, kinship, and reproduction, women are fairly friendless. Outside that sphere, they may work to form unity amongst themselves and with others, with other members of the working class. This is as far as a working woman of India are concerned. When it comes to the middle class household, and as you saw in that film about that black and white film that you saw, set in Hyderabad, the woman is trapped within the family in ways that reflect in her inability to also see herself as a productive worker outside. And that productive work is granted no value. She's not even allowed to think of it as productive. So this is a very complex situation which Gail brings to the fore in her 1970s essay, but which she sort of will develop later as she goes along. So that's one thing. Now, what's important to note here is Gail also does something else. She says that we see women in all these struggles. We see them in Maharashtra in the anti-famine work. We see them, asking prices to be lowered. They are there in the Naxal-dominated struggles in Bihar and Bengal. They are there in the communist-led peasant struggles in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. They are part of an emergent peasant movement in Karnataka. She says all this. But how have these various progressive political parties, especially of the left, understood the women's question? That's something she's very interested in. So women are pressurizing you to think, look, we are here, we are asking for these things. What do you have to say to us? And she says, while yes, people sort of brought out special issues of magazines. This is something we saw in the last set of readings. But in this set of readings, she takes you through this whole gamut of responses. What did parties have to say? Whether it's the CPI, CPM, whether it's the so-called non-traditional left, as she calls it, what did they have to say? Did they come up with new organizational forms? Did they have a better understanding of the women's question? Did they think the women's question was central to their politics? So she's basically asking us, now that all these women are there and saying these things, how might we reclaim them for a feminist and socialist project? And she doesn't think that the official or even the non-traditional left has much to offer. And even if it has anything to offer, that comes from what the women are themselves saying. And that's not given the significance or salience that it deserves. She points out how the large number of Dalit women who are part of the CPM's agricultural wing in Tamil Nadu formed spontaneously, as it were, a women's group in the 1970s, several years before the All India Democratic Women's Association was formed. So there's clearly pressure from below. But then what happens to this pressure? How is it understood? It's not really given theoretical or conceptual value. So that's one thing. The other thing she wants us to notice is that this has to be seen as connected to another form of resistance, which is very, very visible at that time, and that is Dalit agricultural laborers protesting. So the women are also part of that group. That is, they're also agricultural laborers, and many of them are Dalits, but you also have the phenomenon of Dalit assertion. And that's coming in different ways, both in the agrarian areas under communist leadership sometimes, and also in the kind of urban Dalit assertion that you see with the Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra, and also in parts of Bihar where Dalits form the largest segment of the CPI-ML groups that have become active. So she says these two are asking fundamental questions, but what is the theory that we have to help us understand what is it that they are asking? How do we understand these demands? How do we take them forward? Should we rethink our politics? So this is what she expects from the Marxists. This is what she expects from feminists also. And she finds that both groups are wanting. Both groups don't have nearly enough conceptual arguments to offer for the kind of energy that has been put out on the streets. And so she goes, and I have not included those essays for your reading because they're really about agrarian growth in India. But those who are interested can read them later on. They're all there in the EPW. Basically, she then says the problem is the way we understand the social order, what she calls the social totality. Marxists understand it in a certain way. basically her critique of various Marxists is that not only are they not listening to what women are saying and theorizing that in a way that will take forward women's demands as central to the socialist project, neither are they paying heed to what Dalits are saying. And why is that? Is it because they're all upper caste men? Is it because they're all urban thinkers who don't really have a day-to-day experience with what's going on in agrarian India? She doesn't settle for those easy answers. So she doesn't think it's only location, it's only a gender that is responsible. She says, the thing is, we are not really putting our conceptual weight behind this. We need to perform critical labor, a critical labor of thinking about this. And how do we think about this? And that's what she does in a lot of her other essays, where she says, look what's happening to Indian agriculture. Don't just bog down with broad theoretical arguments where you then try to fit what you see on the ground to that theory. See if you can theorize from the ground. Keep your Marxist principles as guiding principles, but don't reduce everything that you see on the ground to those principles. And how do you then do a historical materialist analysis? This is what she challenges the left with. And then she does this very interesting and creative analysis where she says, all of us now want to know if what's going on in the Indian countryside is it a capitalist transformation of the countryside, or is the countryside still feudal? She says that those kinds of questions don't make sense unless you correlate them with data and with specific regions and what's happening in those regions. And once you start doing that, you realize things are very complex. And that, yes, of course, the kind of low wages and the kind of debt bondage or what Dalit agricultural laborers have to endure, these are all terrible things. But you can't get away by saying they are remnants of feudalism. That's not an explanation. You need a more nuanced explanation. You have to tell me, is it the same as what was there 100 years ago? She says, no, that's not the case. 100 years ago, you didn't have capital. 100 years ago, you didn't have farmers growing crops that were being exported so widely. Of course, imperialism had started it, but it's nowhere like what it's today. Neither do you have the government supporting a certain section of the farmers through subsidies, through cooperative banks, the setting up of agricultural institutes. So here you have a very interesting social formation, you know. You have a government invested in the Green Revolution. It's subsidizing rich farmers to produce whatever they produce, whether it's paddy or sugarcane or whatever it is. And what that is leading to in the countryside is a very sharp division between a small segment of rich farmers and a large segment of people who are differentiated in other ways. Not everybody is equally poor or equally rich. Those at the bottom really have only their wages and their labor to depend on, especially the women and the Dalits. But that doesn't mean this is exactly a feudal thing. It's not that the caste system hasn't been disturbed. Of course, it's been disturbed. It's not that you're in servitude because of cultural or social reasons alone. You're in servitude because you're paid so low that you have to borrow. You don't have a choice, and you end up paying that debt through servitude. So she wants us to notice it's not a question of whether this is capitalist or feudal, but basically to see how it is, how systems like caste and how the gender nature of labor, how these actually filter capitalism in India, how they mediate capitalism. So on the one hand, yes, it's not the same as what was before, but that doesn't mean caste has ceased to be irrelevant. So how do you then point to the relevance of caste? And she has some very interesting arguments to offer in this respect, basically saying that look at the Dalit, look at the agricultural workers. Many of them are Dalits, but the significant are also poor peasants, small farmers who can't keep going with their small farms and who also work on other people's farms, therefore. So in that sense, you have a very complex situation wherein you have a large agrarian workforce comprising Dalits and others, but does that make them a proletarian agrarian working class? He says maybe, and she uses the Marxist term, maybe they are a class in itself, but they are not a class for itself because caste comes in the way. And ruling classes use caste to great advantage. And poor peasants themselves are caste conscious because caste has to do with marriage, caste has to do with social boundaries, caste has to do with kinship. So who will you help? Will you help your brother-in-law or the worker who works with you on the farm? Should there be trouble? So I think these are the questions that she raises, and therefore she wants us to see that the totality you see in front of you has to be understood in terms of, yes, certain categories, but those categories themselves have to be rethought. So when you're saying caste, it is not enough to say the caste system has existed for 5,000 years and you see its effects now. No, you see the caste system as also rearranging itself. It does not disappear, it rearranges itself. And that rearrangement, where does it leave the Dalits? Where does it leave the women? And for Gail, both are very important. It leaves the women as a large segment of the workforce with their household labor unaccounted for and being paid low wages. It leaves them in charge of subsistence production. And it leaves the Dalits with the huge burden of doing the hardest work. So this is what she tries to explain. And then later on in the 80s, you'll see her doing something else. She tries to, all those essays on ecology, for example. She says, why must you take women's subsistence labor seriously? Because that's what feeds everybody, one. And two, it also lets you see how women actually are doing the hardest of farm labor and that they are farmers and you're not granting them that dignity or credibility. And what does it mean to be a woman farmer? And she says, drawing on Mandana Shiva and others, some people say that women have a privileged relationship to the environment. They are nurturers. They probably have a greater degree of environmental consciousness. She says she's not sure about that. She doesn't want to go into that subject. But she wants us to see that peasant societies as a whole, have a certain investment in a harmonious relationship to the environment. And here it is a very important argument she's making, because most of us who have read of Gail in a general sense perhaps remember her famous exchange with Arundhati Roy over the NBA, over the Narmada Bachao Andolan, where she felt the Narmada Bachao Andolan was locking itself into a very maximalist position. It's either the dam or no dam. Whereas she says one has to think of more creative alternatives. And she points to the example of Maharashtra, where under the aegis of local movements, across communities, people came together to develop water technology that could serve a large number of villages. She writes about that in detail. And that's where she says peasant societies are invested in a sustainable environmental project also. And it's a project where women can play a very important role. And from there, she goes on to talk about how women's centrality to agriculture must be recognized. It's not recognized. They were the ones who knew about seeds and everything in the past, but that knowledge has been taken away with the Green Revolution and all of that. So basically, she's also trying to tell us why we must take these struggles seriously. And here it's important for us to note, it's not simply that women are victims of violence. Yes, they are. Women are victims of family inequalities. Yes, they are. But equally, it's important to see what you can build on. And what is it that women have that you can build on? Their capacity for struggle, their capabilities as farmers, their knowledge of the environment, and without romanticizing these things, but historicizing them, which is what she does. We may agree or disagree with her understanding of how do you then deal with the fact that government is opening up the farm sector. What do you do with remunerative prices? Do you want more prices for your crops? Do you want farmers to engage directly with the market? Gail has her own opinions on all these matters. So basically, she says small producers forming cooperatives can engage with the market. It is a state that we need to really fight, because the state is a bureaucratic state. It is a very intrusive state. It has not brought anything that is particularly useful to women or Dalits, except perhaps in terms of electoral democracy or education. But in terms of economic growth, it's brought nothing. And she's very critical of what she calls welfareism. Don't give me drought relief. Support me to create a situation where there will be no doubt. Let me be more productive. I don't want to be given handouts. So she's sort of drawing on the labor power and capabilities of the rural population, so to speak. That's very important to her also. So what you then see her doing is thinking of the social totality at a moment when people are in struggle, using the moments of struggle to see how this social totality can be theorized and understood, so that these struggles can be taken forward. So basically what she's showing us is a society has to be grasped in and through its moments of descent, struggle, and fracture. You can't describe a society as a static entity. Like we saw that last time also. You can't just say this is a caste order, there's a Sanskritization logic. No, people are also protesting. They're not accepting this logic. So you have to grasp social totality in and through the moments of dissent, naysaying, and protest. And here the struggles of Dalits and women are very, very important to her. So that's how you grasp the social totality. And this was something that she felt Marxists weren't doing. They were working with static categories. They were looking for proletarianization, whereas it's not so simple. That's not what's happening in rural India. Something else is happening. And they're not looking at the ecological movement. She feels that's a very important thing also. What is the ecological movement at the end of the day? When she looks at Chipko or when she looks at some other local struggles, she says it's really a struggle for a sustainable existence where you don't sort of constantly push the limits of what nature can offer you, but try to work creatively and productively with those limits. It's not a romantic let's live with nature, but how do you actually work with nature? And here I think she was greatly influenced by Mahatma Phule. Though she doesn't say so in so many words, Mahatma Phule's writings on agriculture, for example, whether it's Gulamgiri or Shetkacharya Asood, these are very important texts on agriculture, where Phule shows us what it means to be invested in productivity while keeping in mind justice, equality, especially gender equality, equality between Dalits and others, and what sorts of changes must be made in the environment to enhance productivity, to make available food grains for everybody, and so on. So it's also what we might call an anti-caste environmentalism. I think that's a very important thing that Gail points to. And there's an essay in EPW where she discusses in detail this small dam building project, which she references in these essays, called of sand mining and Bali Raja. Because this is a Bali Raja dam, right, that she talks about. And basically, what she's telling us is there is an environmental consciousness here, but it's not the consciousness that says no to development as such. There is something else that's working here, and women are central to that whole rejuvenating the landscape. Because as she points out, who are the greatest sufferers if there's no water? It's women who have to walk for long distances, etc., and so on. And from the point of view of hygiene too, women and water are very crucially linked. And for Dalits, water is such an important resource considering all the struggles since Mahad over water rights. So in that sense, to keep water central, to make it equitably available, to make it a part of an anti-caste agenda as well. The Dalits have an equal right to what's happening with rejuvenating water service, water as a resource. So all of this she has in mind when she talks of why it's important for us to see that social totality in terms of what we are doing to the environment also. So basically what she's also telling us then is, so you have the women protesting, you have farmers wanting better terms for themselves, wanting to improve their water table, wanting to build dams in a certain fashion. And then you have the environmental movement, which is saying, largely with its roots in Adivasi context, whether it's in Jharkhand or in other parts of India, where Adivasis are saying basically these are our traditional homelands. These are things that are part of our everyday lives. You can't dispossess us of these things. So she's then telling us these three movements have to talk to each other: the environmental movement, the women's movement, and the farmers' movement. They'll have to talk to each other because each is sort of very, very importantly saying things which the other must listen to. So for her, feminism then becomes this thing where it grows in conversation with others. And that conversation for the working group of women she sees as leading the feminist struggle has to do with the environment on the one hand and land and agricultural growth on the other, in her understanding. And within that, where does she bring the feminist content in very pronounced ways is the kind of struggles that she endorses in the rural context. So she, whether it's Chanchwad, the essay on Chanchwad, where you have this big gathering of rural women, or the essay on the widowed and single women, which is a fascinating essay, where she speaks of, and we're all familiar with Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, right? But what is Gail asking us? Women need a home of one's own. They need a home over there. They need a roof over their heads. And the guarantee of that roof automatically allows women greater negotiating and bargaining space. That's what she says. The struggle for housing then is a struggle for women's autonomy, because usually women are counted as members of other people's households, right? Whether it's the father or the husband, even whether it comes to ration cards, whether it comes to pattas or any document, frankly. Um, so basically, she's also saying that all of this has to be also seen from the point of view of how the most marginal in a rural context can actually be part of this politics. So a house of one's own, then a land of one's own. That's also a jump that she makes. And she starts with this segment of women because she feels that that's both materially significant as well as symbolically important. Because that means that any of us can choose to be autonomous and not part of a conjugal kinship caste based household. We can say no to the caste family and we can form units of our own. And interestingly enough, in one of her very last essays, perhaps, which appeared in The Wire, I think, some years ago, she actually speaks of how we might counter the present of environmental destruction, climate change, basically through decentralized economies based on new forms of cooperative living, perhaps like how some of these women in rural India live, supportive of each other and forming a kind of fraternity which is not based on blood or caste or family. So that thought is always with her, that there is a way in which you can rethink women's place in family and society along with these other changes. And that, of course, is a utopian element because she's also aware it's not going to happen now. And she says, how is this different from the agenda of what women's groups elsewhere are saying? That's also very important. And you'll see if you've watched something like Award and Taking Office, what the rural women are saying resonates for those of us who are active in urban contexts and talking about sexual violence, women's reproductive rights, about women's right to a conjugal and sexual existence of their choice, all of that, yes. But also, Gail makes it very clear these cannot remain value-laden statements. And you cannot just look to the law to realize these very important ideals of the feminist movement. What is possible in the here and now, and for the most hardworking and the most important segments of our social order who keep society going, the lives of working Bahujan and Dalit women. So what does singleness mean for them? What does refusing an unhappy conjugality mean for them? What does wanting to live in sexual autonomy mean for them? And that is where you see Gail as fascinating in how she brings ideas and practice together, because she says it does require us to engage with very messy practicalities. How do I get a ration card in my own name? How do I get a patta in my own name? How many visits do I have to make to the Tahsildar's office? What can I expect the government will do? What can I expect the government will not do? A realism about how the state functions. And interestingly, the utopian element she keeps alive. She equally keeps alive the pragmatic element. And I think that balance she strikes is quite fascinating. And she points to those of us in cities who are very excited about ideology and about the different ways of thinking about the future, that this has to work. This has to be made to work. And it can only be made to work minimally in a certain sense, because what is our organizational means to get this to work? Do we have powerful women's organizations that can do this? And that's where she says the emergent autonomous feminism in the cities come up against a wall because they lack the resources to build a huge women's movement. They're not all active in the countryside or elsewhere. But then neither do mass organizations have that potential. So whether it's a CPI, CPM, or these ML parties, she says, look at them. They have the ability to organize, but they are not willing to come to terms with the questions raised by women entirely, or the questions raised by Dalits. So Dalits have organized on their own and they are doing things. But she will raise the question in Reinventing Revolution, how invested are Dalit groups in gender justice? So she'll raise that question from the other end as well. So in a sense, what she's saying is, what is the political form that feminist organizing can take? And she leaves that as an open question. She draws inspiration from different sources, including the Chatrayuga Sangharsh Vahini, including certain segments of left organizing, Nakshalbari. But she doesn't think any of these answers to the very many things that women want, you know, and including the feminist groups that have emerged, they are not adequate to what we want for ourselves. So, and I think this is an important thing because basically she's saying an organization or a politics that answers to all of this cannot but be something that is interconnected. It has to connect with environmental concerns, it has to connect with farmers' concerns, it has to connect with concerns to do with women's lives. Now, what sort of movement would that be? It's not very clear to her. She thinks that one way is to say, yes, these traditional Marxist groups can't do it, feminist groups can do some things, but not other things. But what is the form of this politics, the organizational form of this politics? And she's excited by specific organizations, specific locations, what can be done in particular places. But she doesn't offer that as a program for everybody. So she has this fascinating essay in Space Within the Struggle, Elena Sen's account of women in various movements. Gail has a long essay there as well, and I've put that in your reading, the book in your reading list, where she says, yes, of course, in the farmers' movement, the women's agenda comes up. It's pushed, in fact, because the women themselves want it. And the women are willing to talk of many things, even lesbianism. In fact, they think that essentially humanity is androgynous. But that remains within that framework, and it has to sort of become a more generalized principle. And while she sees the possibility of that emerging from the movement of peasants and workers, she doesn't yet see as having reached a point where it provides the political core of a women's movement. So she leaves the question open basically, but meanwhile, she gives us a way of thinking about gender, caste, the environment, land, and labor. And she also tells us that there are Dalit movements, there are women protesting, there is the farmers' movement, there is the environmental movement. Now you join this jigsaw puzzle and see what happens. How do you join this jigsaw puzzle? That jigsaw puzzle can only be made to work in practice. So what can you make work in practice? What can you not make work in practice? Where can theory help? When does theory turn practical? When does practice guide theory? There's no one solution to any of this. She thinks the Marxists set too much store by theory, that feminists set too much store by personal and individualized experiences. Working women like peasants and agricultural laborers go with their struggle, and out of that struggle seek political clarity. But each of us needs the other in some ways to come up with something else. But she very clearly sees that women in movement, women in struggle, these large number of working Bahujan and Dalit women, as holding the potential to shape the politics of such a movement. Whether they do or not is a different matter, but they have the potential to shape that politics. And as we will see in the next workshop, she will shift her arguments from this terrain to another terrain, because through the 80s and for a better part of the 90s, she's trying to get us to see our social reality in a certain way by keeping in mind caste, gender, the environment, and the specific ways in which women subsidize life itself. Women actually, through their labor, unwaged labor at home and their wage labor in the countryside, make life possible, life and the reproduction of life possible. And she says Marxists haven't understood this, feminists have understood some things, but a lot of it remains at the level of ideas. How do we actualize this understanding so that it leads to a politics? These are her concerns. And so you have her writing Reinventing Revolution. It's as if she's sitting back, she's looking at these various movements and asking us to see how each is a mirror to the other. That book was written in 1993. But then she also shifts gear, because you see what she's also doing is, now clearly we are at an impasse, right? How do we break it? How do we break this conceptual impasse? Where do we look for inspiration? And that is when she turns to the anti-caste traditions in a philosophical sense. And she's always hinted at it. See, even in the last essay you read, 1975 essay last week, she says that people are looking for, in that essay on patriarchy, that big long essay on patriarchy, which I think one of you spoke of last time, Bhakti, I think you spoke of it, where she says that people are looking for feminist inspiration in many places. Some are looking for it in the Gautama Buddha, some are looking for it in the Lokaita tradition. She says that. She's already sort of looking to the anti-caste traditions, and Mahatma Phule is always there in her writings. But she engages more systematically with those traditions in and through her writings on Ambedkar, which starts with, she knows Ambedkar very well. She quotes him in a lot of her work of the 80s. But she engages with what he had to say in a historical sense with Dalits and the democratic revolution. And then from then on, you will see that to discover a possible politics for the feminism that she values, she turns to the anti-caste movements, you know. And this is where again I brought in Deepa's film, which is that segment from Young Historians, because you understand why that would be the case, because there is a historical affective memory that many people in India have of being part of movements or traditions which have challenged caste, whether it's the Kabir Panthi tradition, whether it's the Bhakti tradition in Maharashtra or in Karnataka. Deepa's film deals with Basavanna, the great medieval Bhakti ideologue. And you see how his poetry and his songs live on, right? Children are able to sing them out, and then children are able to comprehend what those are all about. If you've seen that segment, you will know how it's so light-hearted in some ways, but it's saying some very profound things. Wherein children listen to the songs and understand what it means to be a Brahmin or not a Brahmin, what it means to wear a janva or not wear a janva, where whose house are you allowed to go in. So in their own manner, children sort of provide a utopian focus, right? We always say even babe out of the mouth of children, and basically Deepa's film makes us see that utopianism lives on. It's there in some ways, and Gail will turn to those traditions, and which is why I put that film in your thing. And whether it's something like a war or taking office, it shows you that pragmatic political engagement we all need to do with all its attendant limits and its possibilities, right? So feminists who've engaged with sexuality have done something extremely important, as you see from something like a war. You know, that you need to have sovereign control over your body. If you don't have that, you cease to be a non-being. And that is a very important feminist contribution. In taking office, you see how the most marginal amongst the poor, the Joginis, when they contest, and amongst the caste order, when they take to contesting elections, and for Gail, that's very important, women's political participation at the local level. But look at what all they have to endure, right? That the kind of Gundaism, the kind of power structures. But whether it's something like a war, which talks of what the feminist movement has made possible, or whether it's taking office, which shows what the state is sometimes willing to do, you know, with the 73rd and 74th amendments, you'll see how women work these spaces to their advantage, to stating their claims for dignity and equality. And Gail is very aware of that, which is why she doesn't downgrade them at all. She may have a differences with all these spaces. She does not downgrade fighting with the state for reservations or for better education or for representation. She doesn't think any of these are lesser struggles. But we need to do more, is what she's always saying. So and that more takes her in the direction of, let's find a philosophy that would help us conceive of a political form for the feminist politics that we want, and that will take her to Begumpura basically. And all her writings since the late 1990s will really be about the anti-caste traditions. And perhaps part of the reason also is what this country has been witness to since the Mandal Masjid years, where you have a very toxic political imagination take over, whose effects we are still reaping. So without giving up on this political and economic ways of doing things, they doesn't think that they are unimportant. She wants us also to find ways of finding our feminist feet in anti-caste philosophies. And some of the readings for the next class point to that, especially her book reviews. Gail's book reviews are really interesting because that's how she engages with what the women's movement, with what feminists are saying. And through those book reviews, you will see where she finds there are limits, where she finds there are possibilities, and how we might take this conversation ahead and forward. So this is what I want to leave you with today. So reading Gail as a feminist requires us to understand that Gail sees feminism as something that has to speak to the social totality as a whole. You draw inspiration from women's struggles, but you also go on to theorize what is it that women want, how do you then understand those demands, how do you then take and think of new ideas that would make these demands real in some ways, why Marxism has been unable to do it, what are feminism's limits, and how might we think of newer ways of engaging with women's struggles. So I leave you with that, and questions, comments, anything else you wish to say about the films, it's open to you now.
Uh, would you like to take a break of 3 to 4 minutes, the way we did last time, or
Sure,
shall
sure.
we
Take a
continue?
couple of minutes and we can all come back. Yeah.
Okay. 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 So, yeah, Priya, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I thought I'll just quickly raise my hand before other people come in. But yeah, if everyone who was here is here after the break, I can respond. So thank you so much, Dr. Lika.
Yeah, your voice is
Oh,
dropping. Yeah.
was it?
Yeah.
Okay, wait, let me just. Is it better now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, firstly, for introducing us to the entire corpus of Gail Longwith's work. At least for myself, if I speak for myself, I was not aware of the entire range of scholarship that Gail Longwith had been involved in. I had just done, I think, one essay by her in IIT itself during my MPhil. But that was around some tribal struggle. But beyond that, I was not privy to the kind of work she has done. So thank you so much. And also, thank you for introducing us to Deepa Dhanraj's entire corpus of movies and to Ugandhar Film Collective. So something like this was there in 1980, a feminist film collective. So that also is something.
I'm sorry, Priya.
Oh,
Your voice is. I mean, it's not very clear.
I'll rejoin. I'll rejoin if someone else wants to come in till then.
I'm sorry.
No problem. I'll rejoin. Someone else can come in till then.
Okay. Um, would someone else like to raise their questions till then?
Bhakti.
Okay. Please go ahead, Bhakti.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for yet another very engaging lecture. I have two questions. The first is the concept of middle peasant is was not very clear to me. I was not sure whether Gail meant by that the class of farmers that resulted out of the transition that happened in independent India from feudalism to capitalism, or was it the group of farmers that was in between the capitalist farmers and landless laborers? So I was not very sure what to make of that. The second question is on a much broader note. In one of her writings, Gail refers to the Marxist criticism of farmers' movement, and she talks about Prakash Karan's essay of criticizing these movements. I have not read that essay, but I suspect, from what I've understood from her writings, is that she criticized that Marxist. Ignored the fact that state itself as a political entity can be exploitative in its exclusive means to means of exclusive possession of means of violence or deciding the nomenclature. She talks about this census of 1971 quite frequently. So if you could shed some light on this Marxist criticism of farmers movement in India, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. The first one is it's interesting because Gail herself is not very convinced of that term middle peasant. In her other writings, you'll see why she uses it, because it's in use. See, basically, the debate has been, how do you understand the changes that have beset Indian agriculture? So you had a rent receiving system, the zamindars and the jotidars and the others. Now with zamindari abolition, that technically was sort of legislated out of existence. So you couldn't just sit around in your zamindaris, not care about whether your land is yielding anything or not, and merely collect revenue, right? So you had to actually make the land yield produce. This is something independent India was invested in because it had to feed its people. So basically, Zamindari abolition was on the agenda of the Congress party for a very long time. And as one of you has pointed out, that it was the Congress which insisted on this whole productive ethic, and which was in the forefront of making sure that it created the conditions for productive farming through 5-year plans and this, that, and the other. Now, what that does to the Indian countryside is a complex question that Gail takes on. And she says much of this is understood within the terms of a broad Marxist problematic, which is basically Marxists want to know whether we have left behind that zamindari system and that feudal system, and we have entered a capitalist phase, or are there remnants of the feudal system? Is it a semi-feudal phase? And Gail says this question is posed not simply because we want theoretical clarity, because it also leads you then to think of how are you going to mobilize for justice, economic and social justice, who will be your constituency. If you believe that semi-feudal elements are still there in the economy, then you would think of a broad alliance, because a lot of people are affected by the semi-feudal ways of doing things. It is not simply that the very poor landless agricultural laborers who are affected, but also people who suffer unfair tenancy conditions, even peasants with a bit of land but who are expected to perform free service for the landlord, So depending on the quantum of feudalism, then you need to build a broader movement. So it is in that context that the debate starts. And then some people say India has become capitalist because what the Green Revolution has brought to India is that government is putting in so much money. It is subsidizing electricity, water. You know the story about the Green Revolution. And basically, and this is something that some so-called non-traditional Marxists were very concerned with, that the state with its bureaucratic apparatus is emerging as a capitalist force. It is not really taking on, and this also connects to your second question, that what is it doing in agrarian India is it is creating a new class of farmers, not new in the sense that they come from elsewhere, but out of whoever is there, whoever is benefited from zamindari, these large tenants who have now become owners of land, proprietors. Now they are the ones who can actually work the green revolution most effectively, in both in terms of having access to property, and the kinds of land where the technology will be viable, the green revolution technology will be viable. And also to work it, you have to have a clout with government, with all that it entails. And we all know what that means. You have to know your local political bosses, you have to have a good relationship with the bureaucracy, you must have people in Delhi who can work whatever it is that you wish to happen. So it's basically the entrenched class and caste interests that are likely to benefit. Now, the others, and that's a small segment, but there are various others who have smaller pieces of land who are not quite fully able to harvest the benefits of the green revolution, but who can't stay outside of it either. And how do you describe those peasants? And those are sometimes divided into rich peasants, middle peasants, and poor peasants. That segment. And that's where the term middle peasants come. And actually, it's a very clumsy kind of nomenclature. Middle of what? I mean, it doesn't make much sense. And this is what Gail also talks about. In some ways, people also try to map it on to caste categories in an interesting way. If you think of the very rich as comprising the so-called Dvija castes, those who who really traditionally have had access to resources and land and everything. And you think of the large peasant communities who are not like them, but who form a majority as the Shudra cultivating caste, Kurmis, Yadavs, Kapus, the Maratha Kunbis, various others in across India. And of course, the laborers are largely Dalit or Adivasi. So there was that also. So there was a lot of confusion about the term middle. Are you referring to the middle caste, to who? And Gail actually is very aware of this, but she works with those terms because they are widely in use. And as you, I'm sure, have become aware, she doesn't think this way of looking at what's happened in agriculture is very useful. Which is why that she takes umbrage at Prakash Karat's description of the farmers' movement as aiding bourgeois forces or as aiding regressive social conditions. She says it's clearly Marxists have clearly not understood or sought to theorize the changes that have taken place in agrarian India. You have to understand that agrarian India as a whole is subsidizing non-agrarian India. And this doesn't mean that I think everybody in agrarian India can be put together in one pot. That's not what the farmers are saying or as anyone else is saying. But the fact is they are not being paid enough for what they produce or what they work. They have to spend a great deal of money to keep themselves viable. Why? Because we can produce cheap ration food that is then handed out to the poor. Right? And she thinks this is not a great situation. And Marxists are refusing to see that. That's at one level. Second level, they also think any action by the state in terms of intervening in the economy can only be good and socialist. And she doesn't agree with that. She says socialist effects are not produced by the state. The state, by its welfareism, cannot be deemed socialist. Does it produce socialist effects? Does it make for distributive justice? Right? Which is why she also is not very comfortable with state welfareism. She feels at the end of the day, welfare is very little of what is actually owed to the toilers of this country. And we all know that with MNREGA. And we are all fighting to keep it, but it's basically we are fighting to keep a handout in place, not the just deserts of the labor that is owed to the working poor. So Gail was one of the early thinkers to call attention to this. So that was the substance of a disagreement with the left. Actually, her writings can be seen through this period as really a critique of the left party's sins of omission and commission, you know. But she doesn't stay with that. As I said, she's not interested in a deconstructive critique alone. She's saying, where else can we learn from and what else can we learn? So she sees the farmers' movement as a useful space to learn from and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Priya, maybe now you're clearer. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, is it better now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, so I actually did not have a direct question. I just wanted to share what I made of these readings in line with the questions that you had posed.
Sure.
So just wanted to share that, and maybe if anyone else would want to jump in or you want to kind of, reflect on that with me. So thank you, first of all, for introducing with Gail Omwit's work, and as well as with Yugantar Film Collective, Deepa Dhanraj. I was not aware of this corpus of literature as well as films. So that is it was new for me. And coming to the first question, which was put for this week's reading, which was around Gail Omwit's work has been viewed as intersectional theory making, and how do we kind of look at this as a film, and is there any other way to characterize her method in politics? So I just connected it with one of the interviews that I read of Deepa Dhanraj's from last year in Field of Vision, which was around Uganda Collective and the movies that were films and documentaries that were made under that collective. And I take this small excerpt from that interview where the interviewer has asked Deepa about how these movies will fare today. What will be still relevant about the movies made under Uganda Collective, and what might change. So in response to that, she had mentioned that how the films under Uganda presented a collaborative film practice, something which Dr. Geeta also mentioned, where we see all those women talking to the, helping creating the entire arc of the film. So it was a very collaborative film practice, a process where workers and filmmakers could struggle together to build the political trust and that to create that movies together. So that is something which is still very relevant. However, she mentions that, but there was a tendency to look at women narrowly as workers without taking other identities of caste, region, sexuality, and location in account, which Deepa Dhanraj recognizes is something that today it will not work, because we need to see these women not just as workers but in relation to all these other identities. So when I read this interview by her, it was then that it kind of struck me very sharply that what Gail Omwit was doing through her writings throughout. Her one of the primary methodology has been to, even if we just take this gender question to begin with, is to situate this question in connection with other identities of caste, class, region. And region, for example, becomes very important for her. In terms of, say, when she talks about Maharashtra and the women's movement, rural women's movement that starts there, she kind of locates it in the anti-feminine movements of 1971 to 73. And she also says that Bihar had a deadlier famine, but it didn't happen there in that sense, in response to that famine. So something which kind of, and I kind of see her attaching the question of, say, caste, gender, with, say, region, and like all of these together is something which I kind of read as intersectional. Again, talking about the rural women, all the other the literature that I was aware of, if I thought of women's movement, was around dowry, sati, widow remarriage, or divorce issue in Muslim women, and the entire rape law amendment that happened because of some very different infamous cases of rape. That was my limited understanding. But what I see in Gail Omwit's work is that the rural question is brought to the center in a very big way. And even within that, she talks about the women who are deserted, abandoned, and how they are kind of coming together. So a lot of Nipani workers were Devdasis. And she talks about the fact that there was another, Devdasis, and then abandoned divorced women. So I guess within the category of rural women also, she has tried to see the ones who are at the margins and how they are speaking back. So that was there. So that is through that I think that her work. Well, I will kind of then read her work as intersectional. But the other point that I wanted to make on her method of how she has worked is something which I take from her article on the participant study of women's movements, is something which where she kind of forces us to look at the people that we study. For example, we go out and we do our research, the research participants, so to say, how they not just co-create the field, but they themselves are creating the entire movement. So where she says, there is consciousness raising, but at the same time there is also action which is being put. And that is where I guess that is something, that so though her work is in written format, it kind of has the ability to transport us back to those times in a very, very stark way. And I feel that way her methodology is something which is very reflexive and very collaborative, which is something which we as scholars today are always told time and again when we go out on the field or do our research. So that was something which I thought about the first question, and the second one I can come back to later. But something maybe about this, if Dr. Geeta, you would want to get into this, or anyone else.
Yeah. Does anyone want to add anything to what Priya has said along the same lines, or would you like to say something? Otherwise, I can sort of respond very briefly. So thanks, Priya. I really like the way that image you conjured up of Gail's writings, bringing alive a world of struggle and activism. And I think that's the image that sort of underwrites all her work, that so much of it uh, has to do with that universe of struggle and resistance, and the intelligence that informs that struggle. It's not simply struggle as such, and the very deep intelligence that informs that struggle. Very, very quickly, the interesting thing is about intersectionality, the way we tend to use the term, at least in a very sort of generalized fashion, is that we think that if we adopt an intersectional framework, we are actually taking care of sort of ensuring that everyone's voice is being part of this large picture that we are constructing, right? So the marginal voices come to the forefront and so on. But let's also remember that intersectionality has become a kind of epistemic detail in our writings. So we sometimes, I think, I could be wrong, but I think that we use it as an alibi not to really think through the contradictions also that emerge. And I think Gail allows us to think beyond how we habitually think of intersectionality. So basically, what she's telling us is that, say, for example, last week's essay where she compares women's movement in Thailand and India, where she takes these three issues, say the issue of sexual assault or rape, how has a women's movement engaged with it? And she says how important it was that whatever was said, and that changing the rape law or challenging the rape law was important. But beyond that, what difference does it make to the lives of those who endure sexual assault in a rural context or in another context, which is not where you expect these laws to act right away? And she forces us to think of that not in terms only of you have not accounted for that, account for it. So it's not simply that I can say, oops, I forgot, let me think of how this law would look if I kept a Dalit woman in mind. That's not what she wants us to do, because that would still trap us within the limits of discourse itself. I will account for the presence of Dalit or Adivasi or Muslim women, but I'm not thinking through what this accounting for actually means in practice. So, and as we all know from Hatras and from various other instances, that you can be intersectional in your framing of a certain crime, but that does not make fighting that crime any more or less effective. So basically for Gail, therefore, what is effective is how might one produce a politics in rural or in specific parts of India that would enable a continuous and sustained struggle and resistance against sexual assault. She doesn't think it can be done only through a change in legislation. While she concedes it's very important, how do you enact that legislation in practice? So how do you hold local systems of governance accountable? How do you make it possible for women to access those systems of governance? That's what she says in that essay. How do you make it work? And it's not simply a question of theory and application. In thinking, that has to be the case. And we all know this with the Bavari Devi case. that gave rise to this whole Vishaka judgment and the law against sexual harassment, but basically led to a law which, at its very best, is usable only in a defined factory regulated context. How would you make that law work on a construction site? How would you make it work in the informal sector? So basically, it's not simply adding and stirring Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims and coming out with an intersectional thing. But actually, if you thought of this from the point of view of, say, the abandoned single widowed women in the villages, how would they then come up with an understanding of sexual assault? So I think basically Gail wants us to see that in a very classic socialist sense, not in terms of a vanguard so much, but in terms of those that have the greatest to gain by fighting for justice. How would they see this fight against injustice? How might we learn from how they see it? So that's one thing that we can keep in mind. And very true that there was a tendency in the women's movement to think of women in the singular. But I think with films is interesting because you see actual persons. So when you're looking at, say, the BD workers of Nipani, whether you state it or not, you know who they are and what they are and where they come from. So caste and gender become automatically linked in the presence of that form that you see on screen, which is different in writing, which is why I wanted these films to be part of this course, because there's a body of knowledge that emerges in film and art and music, which is very different from the knowledge that you get from texts. And Gail, there was a memorial meeting for Gail some days ago, and her spouse Bharat Patankar spoke very movingly of a great love for music. And many of these songs are shared across resistance cultures. They're not specific to this or that culture. And in that sharing emerges a kind of learning from each other also. So this thing of representation is far more messier and complex than we imagine. And I think Gail was very aware of that. Yes, Shri Rupa.
Hi, Professor. I was quickly wanting to speak about something that you just mentioned
Yes.
about the difference in the writing in the film.
Shri Rupa, why don't you put your video also on so that we can also see you?
Just a minute. My camera is a little
Okay.
uncertain at times. I'll
Okay,
try
okay,
to.
okay.
Actually, it is on, but I don't think it's working.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Never mind. Carry on,
Never mind.
please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, something that stayed with me in the film was a couple of things, but one of the things I was really interested in while watching something like a war was the fact that how the workshop was conducted. So when the women were talking about, I don't know if I should call it a workshop, but when the women were talking about their experiences, firstly, the mesh of people that were in that conversation, it seemed to be across a caste class barrier. Uh, the 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 game or that drawing that was designed for them, I was very fascinated with with the kind of conversations that provoked through that visual depiction of the body parts, and uh, and in turn the conversations that came out of it, of desire, of labor, of uh, uh, of the struggles that they had to face within through the sterilization process. Something which I found very significant in that conversation was that there were, at one point somebody says how she took it upon herself to embrace her sterilization, and she said that I would not have confessed that I know the government was pushing it on me, but when the time came, I said no, I was doing it willingly. So the somewhere the lines between the state and the home and the house, that gets blurred in these impositions, and this kind of brought back in some ways a link between what you mentioned during your talk about how uh, sometimes within Dalit movements or within you know anti-caste movements, there is this dilemma whether we support our men who have been in some ways victims of the oppression that has come down, economic oppression, or as women, do we how do we negotiate our feminist challenges in those circumstances? So I wanted to ask if there can be some light shed on how those conversations were designed, or how it emerged, where people of such diverse backgrounds kind of came together. Uh, I understand how it would work in Taking Office, or I think in Deepa Dhanraj's other film, which is Invoking Justice, where it was more on one community, the focus was. But in something like a ward, that kind of astounded me. The diversity of people that came together in that conversation. The other one was a very disturbing facet within the film, was that what the doctor was talking about while he was conducting those operations, the justifications that he gave while talking about how this procedure was not invasive, how it did not manipulate the vagina and therefore was not as grueling to the body. Uh, and as the camera panned to the woman's face where she was, biting down on something to keep her from screaming out loud. So how the state justifies, or how the medical institution becomes the spokesperson of the state's policies in a certain way, that kind of was very jarring in the film. So yeah, some thoughts on these are a little scattered thoughts, I guess, but some things that I wanted to bring to light, some things that stayed with
Thanks,
me.
Sri Rupa. Thanks a lot. I think they're not as scattered as you imagine them to be. Um, Very generally, I can say that for many of us who are active in the women's movements of the 80s and 90s, there was a great deal of back and forthing between wherever we were located and other places that we connected ourselves with for various reasons, because either we would go and sort of do workshops or talks or discussions on various things, or we were part of women's collectives that were focused on certain aspects of women's lives, like say health or something else. And this was not just restricted to the women's movement, other social movements also were trying to find ways of communicating the kind of information, knowledge, things that say the educated urban middle classes had to say, with others who, not that they are unintelligent or they lack intellectual resources, but who may not have had the time or leisure to take in different kinds of information. So, for example, Gail herself talks of V.M. Dandekar's Institute, which did this long study by doing these local camps in rural Maharashtra, where they went around speaking of women's property rights, the Right to Representation Act, 73rd, 74th Amendments, and so on. So a lot of that was part of the 80s and 90s attempts to, for educated middle class India to actually work in varied constituencies. And the women's movement, especially, this was seen as a very heartfelt, important thing to connect with different kinds of women. Whether that connection actually worked in all instances, whether it made for permanent solidarities, that I think depended on a number of other factors. But it is important to sort of say this, because it's often forgotten that many people risked moving out of their caste class locations to other locations. Some of them made their homes in such locations, like Gail herself did. Some of them kept up a steady back and forth movement. Some of them were researchers, some of them were workers. So different kinds of transitions were possible. Crossovers were also possible. This does not mean that there was perfect equality, or that everything was sort of completely coeval, but it does point to the possibilities of conversation across caste and class, how women may collectively build something together. And that workshop that you saw, where you have that little game of drawing the female body and saying things about how you experience the body, was a staple in feminist circles. Many of us have used it. I myself have used it in different places in rural Tamil Nadu. So this is something that we were all familiar with. And if I may take Rupali's permission, if Deepa wants to say something about her films, that would also be useful. But before I come to that, one of the things also is that this the way in which women express their entitlements, desires, and wants, how there's going to be ambiguity. How do you deal with the state? How do you deal with other women? How do you deal with loved ones in your own family, right? Because they are the ones that you have to live with, but they are the ones also you want to fight. So it's not as if it's a simple equation. And how do you do that? That's a very complex question. And I think Gail points out that there are no easy answers. And I think in that essay on the family in the era of liberalization, she says that in so many words. How do you work with the family? The family is a very difficult space. It's not an easy space. And she says you cannot lessen the contradiction between men and women in the family by saying that they have a common oppressor. That doesn't make that contradiction go away. They may have a common oppressor, but that doesn't mean that this contradiction is taken care of. This is something that she states in her essays. Having said that, she also points to how women might work with it. And I think here her understanding of Chatra Yuga Sangharshvahini is very useful. The Chatra Yuga Sangharshvahini was this socialist anti caste movement inspired by Lohia, which emerged in Bihar. And there she speaks of their land struggles and how central to those struggles were Dalit women who wanted land in their names, who insisted, don't give it in the names of our husbands. It'll go to the pawn shop or to the alcoholic, or it'll be spent on alcohol. So it's also possible that women, without sort of frontally taking up against families, might find ways of negotiating a space for their own understanding of justice and their own understanding of what is owed to them. I think people do this in different ways, and there is no one answer to that question, Shri Rupa. How do they negotiate ambiguities? I think women do that in very complex ways. As feminists, I think we may want to remember that in any situation, there are possibilities for women to be part of a class caste group and either be oppressors. We've seen that also happen. Upper caste women can be part of hate groups and do terrible things along with their men to other women. We saw that in Keralanji, we saw that in Gujarat. It's entirely possible. On the other hand, they may also stand apart from their families and caste groups and do something that's different. So I think much depends on organizing what Gail calls interjection of the conscious element, and how much they can hope to get support for whatever it is that they're doing. It's very difficult to do it individually. So I think many factors play a role, but I think Gail would want us to, as always, be very attentive, be precise, and not extrapolate wildly, but try and understand some level of, try and achieve a level of conceptual understanding that we are always sort of open to rethinking. Like she herself rethought her own position many times. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Just one more thing before I guess Deepak and Raj speaks. Something we were talking about the relevance of the films, and I recently read an article, I think in the Hindu, it was published in 2019, about a B district in Maharashtra where there were large-scale hysterectomies of women working in the farmland, and the reason why so they were having ovary removal surgery, and if I remember correctly, it was for because when their menstrual cycle would come, it would be really daunting for them to work in the fields. So, and while watching something like a war, it brought back that article because in some ways, how do we see as women's labor, reproductive labor or otherwise? And the Bead article kind of undercut the fact that there was an undermining, a devaluing of one kind of labor to enhance the other, and how contradictory or the fix that puts us in as feminist workers, as activists or as researchers or as thinkers who are trying to deal with the problem of the body and labor and its interjections with the state and the family. So yeah, just wanted to.
Yeah. No. I mean, and I think that's something that Gail doesn't ever give up thinking about, that unwaged labor, that the labor of
Yeah.
reproduction is so naturalized that, it's something that you can only think of in extremely violent terms in some ways, that get rid of it or that you continue to be mothers. It's
Yeah.
natural. And I think and I think this whole thing around compulsory sterilization and the kind of stuff you see in something like a war represents the impossibility of doing anything with reproduction, which is not something that women themselves want. It
Yeah.
comes out of that sphere. It is invariably violent. It cannot be otherwise, or it
Yeah.
is invariably sort of praiseworthy in a very cringeworthy way.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's it.
And that's why that films the scene with the doctor and that medical
Yes,
institution
yes,
justifying it
absolutely.
becomes so horrific.
And now you understand what Gail means when she talks of the state being intrusive. It can be
Yeah.
intrusive in a very violent way. So, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think Deepa then Raj could speak 15 minutes. I mean, hello? Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, we have time, 15 minutes,
yeah.
perhaps. If
Deepa,
she,
do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I could.
thank you.
Hi.
No, I
Thanks
mean,
for the films, by the way.
thank you for suggesting them and watching them. I've been feeling like a stalker, sitting here quietly and um, yeah, no, it is actually, when Geeta first suggested that she would use the films in this course with Gail's work, I was a bit not puzzled. I was wondering, where the fit was. Like, how what was Geeta seeing as a possible fit? And but I was very secure because I know Geeta and I know her brilliance, and she would definitely have found a way to, if she needed them in this course, it would have it. It would be helpful. But now, after reading, I've also been reading all the texts and following your course and listening to her. And one of the things I think is first the time period, the Yugantar Collective, 1980 to 83, and what was happening in the women's movement at the time, and the fact that we wore multiple hats, in the sense that the what we would film and the kind of framework or the kind of analytical framework, the way it would be positioned, a lot of that came out of meetings with us in as not, I wouldn't say activists, but definitely part of the movement. So in that sense, there is a sort of contemporaneity with her first book. Definitely, I would say, we will smash this prison. The other thing that whether intuitively or whether it was our own kind of methodology, which is listening attentively and closely to women as they speak about their experiences, and much more importantly, as they theorize from where they are. So theorizing about work, about family, about sexuality. Once we spent time, and we did spend a lot of time, particularly in the second film, in the tobacco film, and spent time because we were there for about 3 months. Women would come in and out of where we were staying, and these very loose kind of conversations to understand, that gave us really the insight that all the assumptions that we had gone with as to what we were planning to do got completely demolished, in the sense of, so even if we were telling a union story, or even if we were telling a story about women and what they were trying to do in the Nipani film, it was totally, I would use the word co-created. It was, we created that film with women, with their voices, to the extent of what we should film and where we should film and what they wanted recreated, and the significance, for example, the long strike scene that you see at night, which is what they definitely wanted that redone. So this is where I think it is that methodology, for example, for us, was very powerful, and I think it has stayed. It actually in all my work, even post the Yugantar films. To come to something like a war, I mean, you asked about the composition of the group. Just very quickly to say that the group comprises of women from rural Rajasthan who were some of the. There was a program called Sathins. They were community workers actually at the state level, and many of them had the first protest against compulsory sterilization that took place in Rajasthan, because was led by these Sathins, because in those days the wage for work program, what is now Narega, women were not allowed to participate unless they got sterilized. And the first protest against this, of against the muster rolls and this kind of way of mobilizing women, was done by these Sathins. So they were part of this group, and they were women from Delhi who were actually working again, in the slums of Delhi as health workers. So, in that sense, it was a group with very, very direct experience of what the health situation that most poor women face, right? The workshops, again, I mean, we were together for 7 days. We stayed in the same place. So they were very loosely framed, long, with a lot of time to, talk about all kinds of things. What you see is the edited version, which then compresses the bits we needed to edit in with the rest of the material. But in that film, the two strands, I mean, the women's vision of how first they saw the state, how they saw the family, and what they envisaged as what reproductive rights for them looked like. That was one complete track, and the other track was really state violence, if you like what was happening either in the camps or even in the very unethical kind of testing of injectable hormones and the vaccine trial, all of that. So I think I've gone on too long. The so just to clear up, because Sri Rupa, you had asked about that, but I think the reason the film was made, and at the time it was made, also to understand the context, that there were two very important legal cases in Supreme Court which had been filed by Saheli and Sri Shakti Sangatna of Hyderabad, both on what is known as informed consent and the illegality of these kind of trials. So at the time when it was made, really something like a war was made, in a sense, to contribute to this political discussion and debate. Like, could it be an intervention, right? Could it be an intervention publicly? And I have to say that it was very successful in that the vaccine trial was stopped because feminists in India spoke to feminists in Canada who put pressure on IDRC to stop the funding. The Norplant testimonies were used again in another case. They were used as legal evidence, for example. So, also in the next UN conference on population and development, the film made a pretty strong impact, and a lot of pressure was put also on the Indian state government to abandon these kind of targets and these sterilization programs. Though, of course, they've all gone back to it now under more covert ways. But the point was that could we have a feminist understanding and a response to what was then the sacred cow, the family planning of India? Like, could we have something that would challenge its eugenic take, for example? It's very anti-poor take, and what they thought they could do to the bodies of poor women. I think that was, yeah, I can stop there.
Thanks, Deepa. So now one has a clear sense of why Gail felt it was important to keep all these conversations going. Whether it's the legal work that people were doing, whether it's the kind of thinking on reproductive rights that feminists were engaged in, or the struggles for a roof over one's head, or the environmental struggles in Chipko. And she refused to valorize one over the other, but neither did she say that she saw all of these as central to the feminist resistance. For her, it was very clearly the agrarian, rural, working Dalit Bahujan women's struggle that ought to be in the forefront, but it ought also to connect with these other things. That was the way she understood things. I think that's remarkable. She kept that position till the very end, and that's really remarkable, which is why I titled this course Thinking Feminism with Gail Omved, because whether it's an invocation of Begumpura, whether it's a critique of the Marxists, it was really our understanding of life as a feminist that was central to both projects. And as we will see in the next workshop, it is feminist that she entreats to take Begumpura seriously. She's not asking anybody else, because she says that we have a stake in this and we ought to take this seriously. So,
There is another question by Sri Rupa.
hi Sri Rupa.
Sorry, I if I could just briefly return to my previous question to Deepa ma'am.
Yes.
I was also wondering, especially since you mentioned the kind of interventions that the testimonies had was able to meet. I was also wondering, while y'all were making the film, wasn't there any resistance from the state or from the medical authorities? Because the frankness with which the doctor allows y'all into the operating room, almost valorizing the program, the sterilization method, and all of that. So I found that also very strange, that it was almost like they were promoting what they were doing. So wasn't at any point there and the resistance for y'all to make this film, or hesitation from their part to allow interviews with y'all and all of that?
Shrirupa, let's come back to that question. Let's keep the focus on Gail, and we'll come
Yeah.
back to this question
Yeah,
towards the
sure.
end. Yeah. Anything else on the readings? Anyone else has anything to say?
If nobody is saying, if nobody is asking any question, I would like to ask one.
Ask Rupali.
Actually, I would like to respond to the questions you had
Yes, yes,
asked the participants to consider. First of all, I do see Umrit's work in. I mean, she's doing intersectional theory making, but I also think that she's going beyond that. I mean, when you discuss things, or when we even do her readings, for example, when I was looking at her reading on, I think, on new social movements, I saw that how she's making a case for women's movement, for Dalit movements per se, and she's saying that she's demarcating properly that what is new social movement and what is not, and how it is different from all social movements, and how, as you rightly stated, that how the traditional Marxist framework was very static, whereas it was not the case. Um, uh, in the Dalit movements, because they were in the realities, in the social realities that were existing during those times. And like, because intersectional theory is not only intersectionality is not only about you know analyzing certain aspects, or seeing seeing intersections of different social identities, but also about building opposition or building resistance. I think she was also doing that in some ways, by conceptualizing these movements differently, by making a case for these movements. And she was also doing in some ways social justice work, which Patricia Hill Collins underlines, that intersectionality is not, I mean, it's also social justice work. So I could reflect through all those aspects when I was engaging with her work, when I was also reading, when I was also listening to you. And second thing, I mean, I don't know. Would it be any other method? I mean, it was an open question, but do you have any other method in your mind? I mean, um, as a scholar who's been engaging with her work, because I could only see intersectionality, but I would like to know whether there was something, beyond that, which we could think about. And second thought, I mean, the second question that uh, you were asking the participants to think along, um, was how how do we understand the debates of feminist, how do we understand current terms of feminist debate. So while I was reading her work on agriculture, on women and agriculture, or so I was thinking that how, I mean, even when we talk about how, even when she was talking about Dalit and mountain women's position, in some ways I see that how she was, I mean, how we cannot fall into how feminists have argued the around the category of choice or autonomy. I mean, we have a lot of debates around them, and it's a very large terrain. But in certain ways, um, the concept of choice has been very static, or autonomy has been very static. But as you have been mentioning it again and again, that Umved asks us to be, very thoughtful when we understand this categorization. She's very careful while examining these positions. So so I really liked how you brought, when, I mean, we are, I was not able to see it, but when you put it out there, then I'm able to make those connections properly. That So yeah, so those were my thoughts.
Thanks, Rupali. I think I put in that question about intersectionality just to make us think a little more about the term, because I think it's, as you said, it's something that's come in as a very useful and productive term for many of us. But does it do all that we want it to do? It's a question that it's worth asking ourselves again and again, because one of the things that I find sometimes, not always, in certain traditions of academic scholarship, especially, or even in, you know, in these days of easy communication, because we're all constantly attending to so many issues that we communicate also about those issues, that intersectionality becomes a shorthand for ticking off all the boxes and not really thinking through things carefully. So, and I think one of the challenges that Gail poses us, her own writing, is the terrifying honesty of her approach. You know, I mean, that's pretty terrifying to say. I said this in 1975 and 84. It doesn't seem that I was right. How many of us would have the courage to say that? A, and B, to also see it not as a personalized thing, but that you do make mistakes. You do think along with others in your own time, and while sometimes you can put yourself apart, oftentimes you are a product of your historical circumstances. And the courage to say, I want to think through this, never mind if I'm politically unpopular. She was very politically unpopular with the left when she upheld the rights of the farmers' movement, and she spoke of the importance of decentralized collectives that could negotiate with the market. We can argue with her, and she would be the first to admit that, yes, let's argue, let's think about it. But I think she risked that unpopularity as well, and which is why I want us to think if there is another approach at work here, where it's not simply that, yes, we have to keep in mind the fact that there's no identity that's not linked to other identities, and we have to therefore account for those, that complex thing, that complexity of identity, so to speak. But if also Gail was saying that we are capable of leaving some things behind but not other things, and why do we leave some things behind and not other things? Is there a moment in history when it's possible to leave everything behind? She wants us to look at history also seriously. How much does it let you do things? How much it doesn't let you do things? Which is why utopia becomes important, because if you can't do something, you can imagine at least, right? And I think in her thought, that's very important. So let's keep that question about intersectionality open. I have no answer to it one way or the other, but I just think it's worth thinking about it, because nothing should become so easy that it's adapted and domesticated, right? And that's one thing. And the second thing about autonomy and choice and everything, certainly it's a very complex question. And while Gail keeps returning to the importance of having distinctive and separate women's movement, what we would call autonomous, to her, autonomy doesn't mean disconnectedness, but she also sees the importance of women organizing on their own, women being a separate political force, which is why the question I posed today, for Gail, the question is, what is the political form of this separate organizing? What forms can it take? Because the autonomous women's movement itself could not provide those forms. They remained bracketed by their metropolitan location for the most part. Of course, some things they said travel to other places, but it didn't travel as a way of political mobilization. So the Marxist mobilization is not working for women. Social movements work to some extent, they don't work in other ways. So I think she's asking us, so is it possible then to want this sense of separateness? Because we all know why we want to be separate. I mean, even a conversation like this may not be possible if there were less women and more men. So clearly there's a logic that makes us see why we need to be separate. But on the other hand, we're also very connected to other movements. So how do we think about it? And I think Gail doesn't want us to stop thinking. She herself moved from being very invested in broad left movements to then broader social movements to then sort of saying, well, my spiritual home is really the anti-caste movement. So she had made that choice. So, but she makes it very clear that it's not a natural choice, or it's not something that you just arrive at on your own. It's a certain political and historical trajectory. So I think that's important. That's what she would want us to notice.
I was also wondering. I mean, sorry. But, I mean, as you said that mostly these movements, women's movements or women's protests, they were mainly happening at the level of cities, and that is why. I mean, my thought was why these three movies, because I saw the first series of the movies which you had suggested, the one on tobacco and the Molkarin tobacco protest, the Molkarin and Idi Katha Matrimina. So I was wondering why these three movies together, and because was it because the protests were happening at the city level and it was apparent, or there was lack of protest, or there was lack of documentation of protest at the level of villages? It was just a question. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no, actually, there was no lack of documentation because Gail does reference so many protests in different
Yes.
states. The
Yes.
documentation was there, but much depended on where one was located. Right, that was very important. So say so, and if you're say in central India, in Hyderabad or in Maharashtra, you would have one kind of access. If you lived in Tamil Nadu, if you were in the CPM, you would have one kind of access. But if you were not and you were from another left group, you would have another kind of access. I think people were also moving from where they were located into looking at things which seemed startling, new, and you wanted to understand. And I think in terms of the three films, the reason for my choice was also that Gail references all three struggles. And that's important. And I think for her, these early struggles in semi-factory settings, whether it's Nipani or in other places, and also in the textile industry later on, the Bombay textile workers strike, which she writes of in the EPW, she's very invested in following trade union work because, as she reminds us, the workers themselves are more radical than the union bosses. So she says, don't judge what workers want by what trade unions ultimately do. Because trade unions do some things within a certain perspective. So I think she was very invested in workers' struggles as such. And it seemed to me, it was pretty uncanny that all those struggles figured in these early films. And I think it was also, as Deepa just said, it was the air that people were breathing, right, at that time. These were all there, and these constituted you as a feminist. You were interested in all these things. You were interested in the working class. You were not sure about what the Marxists were saying, if you wanted to go with them or not. But neither could you go sort of imagine a world where those unions didn't exist. Then we were also very concerned about new forms of understanding labor, like domestic workers. Nobody had seen them as a working class, so to speak. And then, of course, the struggle with family and sexuality and an unlovely marriage. So I think all these were part of what made people feminists. And these films and Gail's work, as Sipa said in We Shall Smash This Prison, really have such a family resemblance. So I wanted us to understand that Gail also emerges out of this milieu, then she does her own thing. Just as Deepa would go on to do her own thing, and others went on to do different things. So I think that those trajectories are both shared and then they diversify, so to speak. And I think that shared thing is important to recognize. So, and nobody could miss out on the fact that the women's movement emerged not simply around Mathura, Ramizabi, and so on, but it did emerge in multiple places. And ultimately, how you receive it is in the form of certain stories. But Gail is telling us another story, and that story is also present in these movies. So,
Thank you so much.
thank you, Rupali, for those questions. So, any other questions, or should we wind up? I'd be grateful if you write anything else also and send me. It's always useful to know how we can take this ahead in different ways. Um, Otherwise, the readings for the next session are simpler because at least 3 or 4 of them are book reviews. I do hope some of you, when you have the time, get to read the larger works in full. I would really recommend Cultural Revolt in a Colonial Society as a must read because just for the sheer newness of Gail's effort, how do you theorize the anti-caste movement? It's a very, very important effort. And also reinventing revolutions. These two I would recommend. Other books you can read at leisure because Dalits and the Democratic Revolution, already some of those things figure in the other essays that that are there. So, but this one is an important one. So, at your leisure and at your time. Say anything else, Kushal, or should we?
No, no,
Oh, Ananya.
I was
Okay.
just listening and learning. So for me, it's a
Okay.
great experience.
Okay. Ananya has a question.
Jed, why don't you ask something?
Ananya?
Okay, Ananya.
I don't have a question.
Okay.
But you sent me a nice piece. Thank you. Jay.
Thank you.
Ananya, no, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I forgot to turn my microphone on.
I'm sorry if this is too late into the session, but I have a few, I suppose, rather just nebulous thoughts in my head. But broadly, what I wanted to just put out there is that I have been engaging with a lot of the literature on the women's movement as it engaged with sexual violence at this time, and how that's and engage with the law on the issue of sexual violence at the time, and how it's sort of taken on from there, even to the contemporary period. So, and I had a few uh, queries and doubts and questions about that material, which, while reading Gail's work, I was sort of pushed in certain directions to think about, and I just wanted to talk about a few of them, which is one, is to say that, rather broadly speaking, in much of the literature there is in the sort of history of feminism that is traced in this literature. You find a kind of time consciousness, which is which is uh, which is incremental. So it talks about, okay, we did this, but we're still here, and on the issue of sexual violence, and often also says, okay, we have to act now because things have changed, but so much hasn't. And I was wondering about fatigue and in women's movements, and whether Gail's sort of utopic but nonetheless pragmatic idea of life and what sustains life and the conditions of life, whether that utopic vision has a way to I don't know, speak to this fatigue and this sort of uh, incremental, where do we go from here, uh, uh, strand that I noticed in these histories. And just the second thing that I wanted to just say is that often when we were talking about intersectionality, in certain instances of, when talking about intersectional feminism, for example, there's a way in which gender becomes the point from which to talk about caste and class, where I feel like there is an element of inclusion and inclusivity that is brought in there, where you want to include uh, you know, uh, as if caste only exists when it comes to Dalit women. And what, again, with Gail's work was interesting and I don't know, refreshing to see, because I haven't been I wasn't very familiar with her work, was that, again, the sort of focus on the lives and conditions of lives of women, this sort of inclusive intersectionality sort of offset, and you get a different model of intersectionality. So is what I thought.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think there's something to be thought of there. The second part I'll start with, because I think what what for Gail seemed very self-evident, which 20 years across we think speaks to us, is that for her the default feminist setting was Baujan Dalit women. You know what I mean? She takes her cues for feminism from their life and activism, right? So while she's very aware of what's going on in the cities, she's aware of what's going on in a global level. I mean, she, after all, subscribes to all these really sort of fringe feminist magazines like Big Mama, and really sort of and very sort of radical lesbian magazines like Off Our Backs. I mean, she's familiar with feminist discourse across the world, and she's clearly, in her head, it's very evident that this is what feminists do and this is what must be done as far as sexuality and the body and reproductive rights are concerned. For her, it seems a given. What doesn't seem a given is something that is startling and radical, which is these poor women, exploited in every sense of the word and socially having to fight for their dignity, hold the power of dissent and resistance. How do you understand that? Where does it come from? And I think, therefore, for her, she starts with that space and she makes us see that space as holding the germ of a future feminist movement back then, And it's not simply that she's saying that I don't want to say this because I'm a middle class woman. and I don't know those lives, but those lives are important. But she's saying, what the hell, those lives are important. They are the lives that are important. And what can I then say about them that allows me to connect everything I see with those lives? It's not bringing those lives into my universe. It's going out of my universe to see how whatever I pick up from Big Mama or from Off My Backs or from these really complex conversations she has with Marxists and Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars. Now, how do I work with all of this so that I can do justice to what I see on the ground, right? I think that's why, Rupali, to go back to intersectionality, it's something that it's useful to an extent to understand what she's doing, but what else is she doing? That's something that I always keep coming back to. It's an interesting thing. I'm not sure how to name it yet, but she's drawing on this rich repertoire of research, scholarship, and her undoubted intellectual gifts to tell us that this is where I really see possibility, potential, and where I feel is a future. And I think that is and then she's not saying it in a condescending way. She's not saying it in the way that we are used to from a certain tradition of theory making, where we say this is the vanguard, this is the proletariat. She's not saying it in that tone either. It's a deep engagement with women's lives also. I think that is interesting for me. So we can think about that. The first part of your thing, whether her utopic endeavor speaks to fatigue, I don't know about fatigue, frankly. I mean, this government makes me tired, but that's a different story. I think each time there are ways within the broad spectrum of women's movements that we've always been both horrified and yet dogged in our understanding of sexual violence. So when in Kairalanji happened, I think it was such a unprecedented thing in Maharashtra, the home of Ambedkarism. And I think it set off a way of thinking about sexual violence, which was important and which perhaps added a lot to what we already knew about sexual violence. Or when, say, when Gujarat 2002 happened. And I think that Saheli, in fact, had a newsletter, a special issue. Ranjana, correct me if I'm wrong, a special issue devoted to how might we think of sexual violence now. And I think constantly you keep going back and asking yourself, what did I not understand, or how well should I understand this? And I think in Gail's own trajectory as a thinker, what she would want us feminists to do, and it is what I will be speaking of next week, it's that let's see where engagement with anti-caste philosophies take us, and why is that important? So I think in that sense, her utopic endeavor is an invitation to think in a completely new direction. So that's where I would leave it at.
Thank you.
Professor Dave, would you like to say something?
No, I think she's quite tired. She's been focused. I can have next session. Unless there are more questions, we can stop then. Thanks so much, Geeta. The amount of effort and scholarship, it's just mind-boggling.
It's a labor of love. I like Gail.
Yeah.
Thanks, Geeta.
Thank you, Dr. Geeta.
Yeah. And thanks. And Sri Rupa, you can connect with Deepa directly and ask her all those questions.
Yes, ma'am, surely. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So see you on the 2nd, which
Second
is
now. Yeah.
Tuesday, right?
Tuesday.
Yeah. Okay. See you all. Bye-bye. Bye.
Rupal, you can stop recording now.